Opening the center, this pawn establishes central influence and prepares piece development for rapid engagement. Developing the knight to f6 is a flexible response, preparing to challenge central control and potentially transpose into various openings. Establishing central influence, white aims to control key squares and prepare for potential kingside pawn advances. Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop solidifies the king's safety and prepares for central pawn breaks. Developing the knight to a central square solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares for further queenside expansion. Targeting the central knight immediately aims to disrupt white's harmonious pawn and piece development and create a structural imbalance. Securing the knight and preparing for queenside expansion, while eyeing potential tactics on the c-file, offers white a solid, flexible position. Developing the knight to a natural square, this piece now eyes the center and supports potential pawn advances, ready to join the central struggle. Bolstering the center pawn and preparing for potential pawn advances like e4 or f4, this move aims for solid development and central control. Securing the monarch behind its pawn shield heralds a period of positional consolidation and careful maneuvering. Sharpening the pressure on the knight, this move initiates a potential pin, forcing black to consider tactical responses or solid defensive structures. Securing the e-file for future action, black prepares for a potential central breakthrough while keeping an eye on white's queenside pressure. Solidifying the pawn center, this move prepares to develop the kingside further and potentially launch a central pawn push. Solidifying the pawn chain opens up the bishop on c8 and prepares for a queenside expansion. Securing the king's flank and preparing a rook lift to the center, white subtly reorganizes forces. Unbalancing the center this way immediately creates dynamic tension and potential pawn weaknesses for both sides. Unleashing the king provides crucial defensive support and prepares a central pawn thrust. Bargaining away the bishop pair often signals an intention to exploit the resulting pawn structure, though one must be mindful of white's lingering kingside initiative. Unlocking the c-file for the rook while weakening the queenside pawn structure. Probing for weaknesses in white's pawn structure, but it invites further complication. Opening the bishop's diagonal after the pawn exchange aims to regain initiative. Centering the queen offers better coordination and readies it for potential action on the kingside or central files. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the e-file adds pressure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing a kingside pawn storm. Knight repositioning opens lines for bishop and eye on the kingside. Unleashing pawns on the kingside, black actively challenges white's central grip, though it potentially weakens the king's safety. Aggressively challenging the doubled pawns opens lines for your pieces while exposing black's king. Securing the king on a safer square amid the dawning pawn storm. Unleashing an offensive on the kingside, white aims to break open lines and exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure. Pushing the pawn forward boldly creates dynamic space, but potentially weakens the king's pawn shield. Stabilizing the kingside pawn structure after black's aggressive advance. Shifting the knight to the kingside files offers a potential pawn break and aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure. Opening the f-file is a bold, direct challenge, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king while disrupting white's pawn structure. Opening the h-file now invites white's rook to infiltrate, potentially creating immediate threats against your king. Striking at the center now opens up lines, potentially creating immediate tactical opportunities or positional pressure on black's king. This audacious pawn thrust injects immediate chaos, challenging white's central control and aiming to open lines toward the king. A tactical regrouping aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance or defending key squares. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for an attack. Bolstering the kingside pawn chain, this maneuver prepares potential knight retreats and supports further pawn advances. Opening the central files now creates dynamic counterplay, but be mindful of the exposed kingside. Retreating the bishop concedes the crucial light squares and allows black to solidify their central pawn presence. Rerouting the knight to the queenside promises increased defensive support and potential counterplay along the d-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside to disrupt black's setup and create new attacking avenues. A bold pawn sacrifice to challenge white's central occupation and open attacking lines. Confronting the doubled pawns, white seizes the open c-file, promising future pressure on the queenside. Reclaiming the central pawn is a priority, but opens the c-file for white's rook and potentially creates a queenside weakness. Consolidating central pawns after the exchange now creates a significant pawn chain. Reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contest the open c-file, a sensible regrouping. The queen repositions to contest the c-file and survey the weakened queenside, preparing for a central pawn push. Abandoning the strong knight for potentially open lines, a bold gambit to unsettle white's queenside. Recapturing the pawn opens the queen's diagonal and reasserts control over the c-file. Reactivating that knight offers fresh attacking potential, though it does leave your king's immediate vicinity a touch less defended. Recapturing the pawn on b4 immediately reignites central tension and prepares to exploit the open c-file. Seeking counterplay by activating the rook, though it risks isolating the queen. Seizing the open file, this capture liberates the queen for active play, creating immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. The rook's bold sortie to the queenside ignites a critical queenside struggle and challenges white's imposing central pawn mass. Sacrificing the queen to shatter black's central pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. Unleashing the rook to its full potential, aiming for a breakthrough on the b-file. Targeting the open c-file with the queen forces concessions, potentially opening avenues for white's rooks. Exploiting the open file, this pawn advances, aiming to shatter the king's defenses through a tactical skirmish. Opening the c-file cracks open black's queenside, creating immense pressure. Unleashing the rook to the second rank creates fascinating tactical possibilities, threatening the queenside structure. Unlocking a mating attack by sacrificing material for a devastating pawn storm initiative on the kingside. Sacrificing material to activate pieces, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pressure and create counterplay. Disrupting the rook's defense of the pawn chain creates immediate tactical opportunities. Black bravely sacrifices material, aiming to create chaos and expose white's king through a desperate pawn storm. Unleashing the pinned pawn sacrifices piece dynamics to open critical lines against black's beleaguered king. Igniting fireworks on the kingside, black offers a daring gambit to unravel white's central grip. Unleashing a calculated pawn storm at the expense of king's safety, this advance exposes white's monarch to immediate tactical threats. Unleashing the queen aggressively opens lines towards the king, but leaves the pawn structure vulnerable. Activating the rook to a more central position can pressure black's slightly exposed king and create attacking opportunities. The pawn sacrifice aims to destabilize white's structure and expose the king to the looming queen and rook. Unleashing a royal fork, white forces material recovery and disrupts black's active pieces. Protecting the king's new sanctuary on the 7th rank allows the queen to explore active counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop opens a critical diagonal, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and seize control of the newly cleared center. Sacrificing the knight to unleash a powerful pawn, storm towards white's beleaguered king creates immediate chaos. Unleashing a devastating discovered check that rips open the kingside and exposes the black monarch. Sacrificing the bishop opens a path for the rook, but it leaves the king dangerously exposed. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack, white rips open the way to black's exposed monarch. The queen retreats, aiming to rejoin the defense and offer support to the beleaguered king.